There he is. Where? There. What, behind the rabbit? It is the rabbit. You silly sod. What? You got us all worked up. Well, that's no ordinary rabbit. Oh. That's the most foul, cruel, and bad-tempered rodent you ever set eyes on. You.
Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you. I picked up quite a few new followers off of that last video that I released. So if you are new and joining for the first of these lives, welcome to you. Welcome aboard. We are happy to have you. This is a very, very serial channel. I take things very serial. No joking on this channel. None of that nonsense here. So you guys that are new, strap in, get ready. Now, forewarning, it's been a long week, especially for those of us who are Americans. I have been a little bit disjointed this week, a little bit discombobulated. I do have my notes together, so that's not the problem. It's just my mind has been very distracted. One of the things I don't know if I've ever discussed it on this channel so much. I try to keep this channel, the window into my life and interests, very, very narrow on this channel, because I carry the names, as you could see, City of the Immaculata. And I feel like I have to represent, to the best of my ability, the honor and integrity that comes with the institution that St. Maximilian Kolbe created. And I would never want to do anything to discredit or dishonor that name. So certain parts of my personality and character, I really do. And I think it's a good thing. I've thought before about dropping City of the Immaculata, but I was like, no, it holds me accountable. Those of you that know me, I'm Brian. You get a pretty good idea of who I am. But I will say it's been quite a week. I've, as someone where I was beginning with that was at one time in my life, my previous life, I was very interested in politics, U.S. politics in particular. And, every 4 years in America, things get kind of interesting, and more so in the last 12 years at this point, things have been particularly interesting. So I get kind of swept up into it myself, and I have to kind of you ride that wave for the week, the 2 weeks, whatever it is, and then you have to kind of settle yourself back down. So I'm just kind of getting back into the role of things. But again, that's kind of where my mind has been recently, is on the American political scene, as probably has been for many of you guys. Now, as it relates to today's conversation, as with all of these things, I always want to be clear, for those of you especially that are maybe joining for the first time with these lives, that just because you find me talking about something on this channel doesn't mean that I'm endorsing said thing. Even if it may sound like it at times, as the historian that I try to be, and I mean objective historian, at times I will try to get into the mindset and the and maybe you could apply it like it's sort of a Thomistic approach to even people that I oppose, to try to give their opinions and the justifications that they did for the things that they did, to present it in the best light possible. What that does, though, at times is it makes it seem like I am endorsing said thing. So Really want to be clear right out from the front about that. I try in my quest for objectivity to not attempt right, is that a double negative? I try to not attempt to put my prejudices on, say, for example, the medieval people. And I love the medieval people. I really do. Medieval people have a bad reputation, and it's been a bad rap for a very long time from multiple fronts. From first, they got hit hard from the Protestants, and then, in some ways, as a sort of counter to the Protestants, they got hit hard from the Baroque period of the Catholic Church after Trent. And then finally, certainly the major blow to the medieval people was from the Enlightenment, the sort of ultimate kind of rejection of the classical way and thought and life that these people lived. Hence, how they came up with the, in many ways, derogatory categorization of their period as the Dark Ages, which we have attempted to obliterate that stereotype on this channel. I have it re-released as a podcast if you want to go back and see that. Yet we are, granted, in so many ways removed from these people to the point that they can seem alien to us in many ways. But all throughout, I think, even from the Protestant Reformation forward, I do think that there's been something of like a longing for certain ethos of aspects of medieval life. You find that with the popularity of, think of Robin Hood, think of the chivalry and knighthood. Renaissance festivals have always been a thing. Renaissance festivals, which are, and many times inappropriately named as they're really medieval festivals. It's never really truly left us. And even in recent years, I think we're finally beginning to recognize the legitimacy of the Crusades. But there's still a lot that we have to do to get to where we can bring justice to a people who have been so maligned. And make no mistake, much of the campaign to malign medieval people is, excuse me, by default to discredit the church. First by the reformers who wanted to discredit the Catholic Church, then by secularists at large who wanted to discredit Christianity. On this channel, I talk a lot about putting on historical lens. Which lens are you wearing as an historian? And how do you wear a lens? How do you even begin to wear a lens of a people who in many ways are very alien to us? As alien as, say, some isolated tribe on some island somewhere, as alien as they would be. And I think a good start for the medieval world is to kind of look at how the strata of society worked in those days, because there are similarities and differences that I think may begin to sort of, in your mind, as we're asking the sort of tongue-in-cheek question, could you survive as a medieval? I think this is a good start, because while it's kind of a simplification, the society really is a tripartite structure where you have the oratores and the bellatores and the laboratores. Three-part structure. That is those who pray, those who fight, and those who labor. And as a medieval, you really did have to accept your lot in society. It was given to you by God, and you weren't going to excel up any ladder if you were born into the peasant class, especially if you were born into the serf class. Now, to be clear, sometimes, and I have not emphasized this enough, I don't think, in the previous videos that I've done on medieval life, there is a strata even amongst the peasant class. Some peasants could actually own the land that they lived on and worked. Some lived quite comfortably for the times. The lowest of the peasants, though, was the serf, and those were the ones who were essentially owned by the nobles. Life for these people was admitted to by all parties to be exceptionally harsh. These laboratores, these laborers, their purpose, their only value that they gave to society was their ability to produce. And it was the products of their labor that gave them value. And to be clear, we're not talking, I've talked about this in the last live that I did about this. It was kind of a purpose of my bringing that up, was to make sense of this live when I talked about slavery. There was, especially like among churchmen, there was a clear distinction between a serf as like owned by the nobles, meaning that they couldn't pack up and leave and go live somewhere else, while also recognizing the dignity of this peasant as a Christian and as a human being, as opposed to later when you end up with the chattel slavery situation. Go back and watch that last live if you want to kind of get into those distinctions. But these people, their ability to clear and tend the land, it was accepted by the bellatores, the nobles, those who fought, that the nobles themselves had come to rely on the labor of the peasants. They couldn't function without it. And in return, they provided protection to said peasants. At least that was the claim. Now, you as a modern, I can't help but think that this alone would make survival in the Middle Ages a non-starter. We are all products of the Enlightenment in so many ways, I myself included. I love my independence. I love to go where I want, to be who I want to be. I love the fact that I could sit down and study and learn all of these things, or I could go, hike out in the woods, take my family wherever, whatever it is. I have options, right? We love our options. But I guess to wear the lens of the medieval people, they didn't exactly know any better, and they weren't necessarily the better because of that, but there isn't necessarily like clear examples of a kind of class frustration, with some obvious exceptions. You can begin with like the Peasants' Revolt. I think by the time you get to the Peasants' Revolt, though, you're really, really, really stretching into the modern world. The Peasants' Revolt came about largely as a result of the Black Death in the 15th century. And there was a complete restructuring of we're talking about pre-Black Death here, basically. There was a restructuring of the order of society after the Black Death that in many ways, especially as you get past the printing press and things like that, it changed all of this. That's when you kind of enter modernity. But for the most part, people kind of accepted their lot. Though Edmer, student of Anselm, called the peasants, they were the luckless class. So it wasn't like people were totally oblivious to the conditions that, like, if you were a serf, what your condition was. But I do think that this condition that people found themselves in, there were, besides the really extreme events like the Peasants' Revolt later, there were also these like little moments littered throughout where that kind of like exploded into a popular fervor. Take, for example, in 1095, after Urban II calls for a crusade. Now, Urban knew the order of his world. The papacy was very clear, Urban was very clear that he was calling on the knights of Europe to take the cross. He was not trying to upend society by saying, hey, brothers, let's all go fight. If you were a peasant, the expectation was, and he's explicit about this, you were to stay in your station. You were to stay in your station and do your God-ordained labor. Specifically, he's calling upon the nobles and knights of Europe to go fight the crusade. But regardless of this, the spirit of the crusade caught. And the first to actually take off for the Holy Land, to take off for the East, were not knights, but they were rather peasants in the so-called People's Crusade. And I am convinced that this was the kind of thing where the like energy of a people as individuals and as collectives can sort of fester, and it needs an outlet. And sometimes there's no outlet and there's nothing you can do about it, and it just sort of tapers off. And every once in a while there's an outlet, and this call for the crusade sort of, even though it wasn't Urban's intent, it sort of gave an outlet to this energy. And so these people, they thought there was the hermit who led them that was sort of preaching that they were going to die in glory, and they could receive this indulgence, even though the indulgence was specifically for those that the Pope had called. Never mind that. Now, of course, the People's Crusade floundered before reaching the Holy Land, but it is an indicator that despite the normalcy and compliance of the order at large, there were these occasions of exception where the peasants sort of broke out of their stations in life to do something kind of extraordinary. There's also the really, really fascinating one of these dance crazes from this period. I've talked about these in a video. I think it was my video on medieval piety. But this was this very, very weird phenomenon where people, you could imagine you're looking out your Mr. Peasant, and you look out your window and, oh, look, there's Susie again dancing in the street. Oh, and now Liza has joined her. And now Robert. And then the next thing you know, there's hundreds of people just dancing in the streets for days, for weeks sometimes. Now, I have my doubts about what this is. There are times when the mystic in me believes that something else was at play. But one plausible, natural explanation of these was that the people were just frustrated with the humdrum of life. And to do this, oh, I don't know what came over me. You could see the church and the noblemen are just kind of like scratching their heads. They have no idea, like, what the heck is this all about? So without condemning the people, I mean, because what could you do? Arrest hundreds of people who you needed actually for them to get back to work? And the people, so goes the theory, they know this. And so to get out of that drudgery of life, if you see Susie and Liza and Robert and the rest of the town engaged in this crazy dance, well, I could join that, or I could get back over here to my plow. Okay, I'm going to go dance for a few hours. It got you out of work for a few days. But can you imagine that, right? Like, what is life like where that's sort of what you're reduced to, to sort of, I mean, today you might take, I don't know, a few days off of work, kick your feet up, read a book, maybe go to the beach or something, right? And then you didn't have those kind of outlets. Now, by the time of the High Middle Ages, there does become one way out, and that is the way of the religious life. Now, to be clear, the religious life was supposed to be open to all always, but the reality is that, little Johnny peasant is needed to go and cut in the wheat fields, and I can't afford for him to go off and be a monk somewhere. For a chunk of the Middle Ages, monastic life became about mostly, you were of a noble family, and your youngest children, well, your elder children, the family had already placed them and their sons and their daughters in all of the important places that they needed them, marrying them off where they could, so that now the youngest, they could afford for them to go into a monastery, which, the monasteries at the times, some monasteries were very well to do. So as far as their worth goes, it wasn't actually a bad investment to send one of your sons to one of these larger monasteries. Now, with the monastic revolutions, first with the Augustinians and then the Cistercians in the 11th century, and then later in the Dominicans and the Franciscans, all of that really begins to change, especially with the mendicants. They were kind of the great equalizer of the church and of society in many ways. Now, you still get your parents that aren't crazy about the idea of your children. I mean, even among the nobles, there's the St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, had problems with his family when he attempted to join the Dominicans, and they locked him away for 2 years and even tried to tempt him with a woman. And this was not, Thomas's family wasn't doing anything that other families hadn't tried before. Oftentimes, you take the younger brother who's got a crazy idea, you lock him in a tower, you tempt him with a woman, next thing you know, problem solved. Thomas was a very special man, though, and his loins were girded by the angels. Many of our monastic saints actually had to fight family to join all through church history, and this period's no different. But certainly by the time that St. Robert Bellarmine is writing, he says without equivocation, and this would be the 17th century, that there is within Christianity a means for a person to get an education and to ascend in this earthly life. Because the argument is you're born into your station in life, and we know, at least through the lens of modernity, that there's some pretty brilliant and intelligent and talented people that just happen to be born in the bottom strata of society. I think history has proved this to us. And Bellarmine is saying is that there actually was an option for these, because these arguments were already showing up in Bellarmine's time. And he was saying, no, there actually is a means for these people to ascend. It's in the religious life. And it wasn't, it was in theory, it wasn't unheard of, even in practice, that a person of lowly origins could attain some of the highest positions in the church. But I wonder, with those of you out there, would you forego marriage? Would you forego the comforts of your noble upbringing and the pleasures of a family life and life with a spouse and children so that you could receive the education that you so desired? That's kind of the trade-off in this period. The trade-off is the celibate life worth it to you? Now, because today, of course, you have the option of both. You can both be educated and be a married person. In fact, it's quite common, and what's the word I'm looking for? It's common, and it's not just accepted, it's advocated in our modern society. In those days, really, to have that education, that formal education, you would have to enter monastery before you'd ever learn how to read and write. Now, granted, I don't see why so many people are appalled. What's the word? Not appalled. I don't see why so many people are repulsed by the idea of celibacy. When I first converted, I kind of, in the back of my mind, I hadn't met my wife at this point. I kind of thought I may go the route of a monastic life, but alas, I met my wife and chose a different course. But of that subject, what about the subject of marriage? I did a lecture on marriage in the Middle Ages. It's all part of this long medieval series that I've been doing. You can find the podcast. Go back in the podcast playlist if you're interested in any of this. But this does seem to be one area where, maybe due to the circumstances the nobility found themselves in, where in the noble class, in the aristocratic class, in the higher classes, marriages were the marriage of your children were used as leverage for wealth, for the accumulation of wealth, the power, alliances. These things were often very, very heavily regulated. As I was preparing for this last lecture that I put together on the year 1182, it's on my lives. You can go see it. It's just the most recent one that I did if you haven't seen it already. I had mentioned in there the betrothal of Louis VII, King Louis VII's daughter, 8-year-old daughter, to Manuel. I think it's Manuel's. Yeah, Manuel's son, Alexios II. At 8, and Manuel's son is not of age. He's a young boy. Louis's daughter is 7 or 8 years old. She's betrothed. She has to be removed from her life in France to go live and learn the ways of the court in Constantinople. There was no, one thing, the 8-year-old couldn't consent anyways, but two, there was no thought of, well, when she gets older, she might want to choose someone. No, it was like, we've married you off, and that's what it is. But for the lay folk, marriage was mainly a matter of circumstance and expediency. Oh, this young fair maiden over there, she's single, and the priest in the confession told me I might need to go ahead and wed someone. So this urges of mine could be relieved. So be it. Now, if she was tied to the land, of course, I would have to get the Lord's permission, not her father's permission, the Lord's permission, that this property of his could be allowed to come live on my Lord's property. And through this weird complexities of what's happening at the ground level with marriages in the Christian world, you really get this long ascent with what we would formally recognize as the marriage sacrament today. Because technically, in those days, the only thing you needed was the consent of the spouse for a marriage to be considered valid, with the marital act being the sign of consummation. And a clear indicator that the marital act had taken place, of course, would be the pregnant woman. But for a time, you actually didn't need a priest. You and the new missus, would-be missus, would say yes to each other. You'd preferably be wed, which was like a sign, an indicator, right? You get the main thing that we did was we did the wedding ring. This being a sign to the public that this woman is now your wife. Then you would do the marital act. And as far as the church was concerned, you're married, folks. Now, this, of course, causes all kinds of problems later on. Let's say, oh, ye fair maiden, she didn't fare so well later in life. And, there's jerk that I am. I kind of decide later on, 10 years down the road, after she's given me 10 children, I don't think I ever actually consented to this. And as the wife, she could turn to the church, but the church's first thing was, hey, did anybody actually like witness you guys get married? Oh, no one witnessed it? No priest? Well, so you could see, the canon lawyers over time, the church begins to declare that, through its use of positive law, to make it such that marriage had to be officiated by a priest and in the presence of another witness with public consent given. And this tended to clear up the problem, at least as far as society was concerned at the time. But marriage is unique in this sense because even today, it is still the case that it's the couple, not the priest, who administers the sacraments to one another. But ladies, all three of the ladies in my audience, do you like this setup? Is this like comforting and securing to you that your husband, takes you on a little date in the woods and then voila, you're married. You go home a married woman. So that's kind of one of these trade-offs, right? Like, would I want to live in this world where the fortunes of my life were built on, at times, some very unstable. We want to look back on the Middle Ages as a time of relative stability, but for the individual, it could oftentimes be very unstable. Now, what's your relation to the church? For the medievals, it's a very, very different thing than you would experience church life today in the Catholic Church in many ways. Don't get me wrong, there's many ways in which it would be familiar. There's many things that you would recognize as a Catholic, but it's not, and we are in many ways products as Catholics of the Tridentine reforms. Again, I have a podcast. Go see my podcast on the Tridentine reforms if you're wondering, just to get you started on how different some of this stuff became. But for the medievals, your life was deeply wrapped up in the sacramental life. And I don't mean to imply that Catholics today don't have a sacramental life. I'm just saying the extent to which the medievals, and this is one area that I really admire them, the faith that they were living was truly a lived thing. They really did have an otherworldly sense in many ways that would be more reminiscent of older times and customs than to our own. We are so modified and warped. Our perception of the world is so modified and warped by the scientific revolution. The enchantment of the world is dead to many of us. Not so for the medievals. Now, of course, the Protestants would come along in the 16th century and ruin it for all of us. We in some ways in some ways overcorrected ourselves as a reaction to the Protestant complaints of medieval, what they would qualify as medieval superstitions. I do have to be careful how I say this because these are one of the things where I can kind of be taken out of context at time. Yes, I do think there were aspects of medieval piety and belief that needed to be reformed. Absolutely, no doubt. But it's at times you read what happened and you see things in hindsight, and it almost feels like chemotherapy, where to kill the tumor, you almost need to kill the patient. And I think we, as a result, are much more worldly than the medieval people were. And you Protestants out there, maybe all two of you that watch my channel, would say that this was, we were just cleansing the Christian world of superstitious beliefs. But the medieval people truly believed in the real presence. You see their reaction, the development of the elevation of the host and the priest, raising it higher and higher so that the medieval people, they wanted to adore the development of adoration. They knew that the priest was acting in the person of Christ, and you get this sense that they had an almost mystical belief in their priests beyond just the priest was a good man, because many times in the Middle Ages, the priests were not necessarily good people. But the medieval people, as I said before, were so thoroughly cleansed of the Donatist heresy, they knew the distinction between the in persona and the person themselves. But certainly by the high Middle Ages, the Church of Europe had so penetrated the social milieu that there was no aspect of your life that was not in some ways caught up with the church, or at least under the influence of. If you had to tend to your crops, say the season was running out, harvest was coming, but it was a holy day of rest, guess what? Your crops were going to wait. You would just have to work later hours at a later date. You get to try to catch back up. Now, what about my sportsmen brothers out there, those that like to engage in sports and hunting and all of these things that you long for? Surely you would have been in the Middle Ages a master jouster or the king of falconry. Maybe, possibly. Unlikely, unless you were born and raised into a very small specific class. The tournaments are the stuff of legends from the Middle Ages for sure, right? The tournaments served many purposes as well. They allowed the knights of Europe to make a name for themselves. An individual knight could make a name for himself, not even so much on the battlefield as he would in these tournaments, thereby using their fame for leverage later in life. As well, it was a preparation for the kind of experience that one could, as close as possible, stimulate in the chaos of battle. And to be sure, it was a dangerous business, which is partly why they were so popular. Everyone wanted to attend to see the chance of injury and death, like what you may expect from NASCAR racing today or something like that. It's always the possibility. So I'm pretty sure, I'm not denigrating NASCAR fans out there, but I know you NASCAR fans, one of the reasons you guys go, and people have told me this before, is that there's the possibility of a wreck. Right? That's one of the reasons that you're there. King John of England's brother, for example, died in a tournament in 1186. Popes and bishops all throughout Christendom condemned tournaments, but the nobility were not about to quell something that in their eyes served so many purposes. But if you were a man and you wanted to join the tournament or you wanted to go on a hunt, again, you were out of luck. Hunting was reserved for the nobility alone, and at a great penalty if you broke it, if you broke the law. These hunts were events for the highest strata of society to bond with one another and to pass time. And it was addicting pursuit, as it is to this day. I have friends who hunt, and I know they end up, I say addicting loosely, right? It's the thrill of the pursuit becomes a very powerful thing. So that's why I know the friends of mine that like to hunt. They love the thrill of the pursuit. Some kings were known actually to stock their forests with game. Some kings like Henry II actually was well known for their love of falconry. maybe the most famous class of any group outside of the knight class in the Middle Ages was the English yeomen, who became skilled hunters and archers, who in turn utilized this, what eventually would develop into the longbow. And it was so famous because the yeomen played such a decisive role in the downfall of the knights when they defeated the French at Crécy and Agincourt. But now let's say that you decided to go on the hunt or to do some other illegal thing. How in the Middle Ages would the courts of law handle you?
Will? Well, we did do the nose.
The nose?
And the hat. But she's a witch.
Did you dress her up like this?
No!
No!
Yes. Yeah, a bit.
A bit.
She has got a wart.
So in the Middle Ages, what may be one of the craziest features of life for these people in terms of the way that modern eyes would see it is what is known by the trial by ordeal. As always, this has different meanings in different times. It was more prominent on the continent than it was in England, which began to evolve and tend towards English common law, which evolves into our in the United States and all of the English-speaking world. English-speaking countries, anyways. The English common law and the modern legal systems, which evolve out of it. Very, very admirable in many ways. But trial by ordeal, what is this? So let's say Peasant Bob has accused Peasant Trevor of stealing his chickens and sleeping with his wife. Peasant Bob, he knows that Trevor did it. He's absolutely sure of it. But there were no witnesses, and Trevor wasn't caught with any chickens. So the way to resolve this was to go through some ordeal. What this would consist of is you would gather your weapons, clubs, fingernails, teeth, whatever you had at hand, and you would fight it out mano a mano in front of a large crowd. Now, let's say that Peasant Trevor, the accused, gets the better of poor Peasant Bob, and Bob gets his ass handed to him. Well, this is clearly a sign that Peasant Bob bared false witness, and the judges may just decide that the punishment for Peasant Bob is castration. This is actually something that happened, by the way. This, my friends, is the trial by ordeal. So you get this sense that medieval people are just freaking nuts, right? That they do not know what they're doing, and they just kind of make it up as they go along. And I have heard that trial by ordeal specifically, since proving guilt, because remember, this is before all of the sort of formularies of English common law, like precedents and witnesses and trial by jury and defense and prosecution. All of these things is still being developed. So how do you, as a judge, determine something like a murder case, for example, without tying up the courts with these endless squabbles? Well, it could just be that this was the practical way of dealing with the reality that the legal system of the day was just not equipped to handle certain things. And they were going to make damn sure that you really wanted to press the issue. Peasant Bob beforehand gets to thinking, maybe Trevor did steal those chickens, but maybe he didn't. Maybe the chickens just ran away. And Peasant Bob doesn't like his wife all that much anyways. So what's the big deal? He's just going to let it go. Is it really worth it? And it could be that that was the mindset, just to make it so hard and so crazy that no one wants to accuse anyone, especially not by risking false accusations. Now, that tends to be a legal system which is based on the guilty getting, what would be the word? My legalese is not very up to date, it would tend to side with the guilty in that sense, because those that are the prosecutors, the accusers, were going to have a very, very difficult time to objectively make a case unless Peasant Bob just happens to be stronger than Peasant Trevor, and he could beat him up, soundly in a fight, and he isn't concerned about it. Otherwise, you may have to be in a very tight predicament. Now, we could go on. I could easily kill any interest that you would have as a modern person of living in the Middle Ages by discussing the most obvious things like their medical practices or their dentistry or where the human waste went to and how much of it you were walking in. But I think all of that stuff is just a little bit too easy. Would I want to live as a medieval peasant? That's the that's the ultimate question. In all reality, probably not. Maybe in some ways, I wish that we could grasp back their sense of the transcendent. If I could view the world and reality from my waking to sleeping hours in the same way that they did, while also keeping my dentist, I would be okay with the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, though, it's kind of a moot point, because as a 40-year-old man who also comes from, I know, a family that in the United States, anyways, were Quakers who were originally Puritans, which is a good indicator, and even with my last name, is a good indicator that I came from peasant stock, right? So it's a good chance that I probably, as a medieval peasant, probably would have been dead by now. So yeah, it's all would have been a moot point. But in some ways, I admire. I think it should be clear with this channel, I admire certain things about the Middle Ages, but I just want to make sure that we always have a clear representation, and that we're not reading Thomas Aquinas or reading the Beauty of Saint Bonaventure, or seeing these like decrees that the church is putting out where they're condemning things that were obviously evil, and thinking that that had some kind of immediate impact on society. As I've expressed many times in this channel, society takes a long time to catch up with the church, if it ever does, in many ways. So that's most of the lecture of what I had for you guys today. I would, another thing is to talk about like medieval music. And I do have kind of a serious melody I want to leave you all with to contemplate and to think about as you imagine yourself as a knight on the way to the Holy Land, defending the cross, or even just a knight working in England and France, tending to your land, tending to your people, and the seriousness that goes with such a job. And there was one peasant who I think wrote a song that really kind of sums up the reality and the harshness and the seriousness of all of that. And I will leave you with that. God bless you all.
Bravely bold Sir Robin rode forth from Camelot. He was not afraid to die, oh brave Sir Robin. He was not at all afraid to be killed in nasty ways. Brave, 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 brave Sir Robin. He was not in the least bit scared to be mashed into a pulp, or to have his eyes gouged out and his elbows broken, to have his kneecap split and his body burned away.